I've just watched the 2015 film Suffragette with Carey Mulligan. No copyright infringement intended. This is the film I'm referring to. It's a powerful film. I don't really intend this one as a film review, but it will come into it. Because it might be the most prominent feature production actually about the subject, at least in the British film industry. Um, it is a moving film, particularly the climatic ending. It's good acting. But I've always felt that it had a bit of it certainly had an agenda, but it had a narrative that I think is somewhat misleading, and it's a narrative that's been repeated many times over the last century, which is that the violent direct action tactics of the suffragettes got women to vote. We've seen this rehashed with some eco-extremism in recent years. You know, whenever the likes of Just Stop Oil have been arrested, they quote the suffragettes. Um, but I think this needs to be analysed a bit. As a matter of context, I'm going to read out some of the incidents that they were involved in. I'm talking about the suffragettes here. Very briefly on the film itself. Like I said, it's powerful acting. It sort of shows how Carey Mulligan is a working class factory girl who gets kind of brought into this movement. Initially, she was reluctant, but then she gets gradually radicalized and brought into the movement. And it finishes with Emily Davison's death at Epsom Racecourse. That's a very famous event in the suffragette movement, in part because it was filmed. It's very graphic to watch, and the film it's a very suspenseful moment when she goes onto the track and attempts to pin a ribbon to the king's horse. To this day, there's some debate over what exactly she was intending to do, whether she was intending to be a martyr, whether she was intending solely to make a protest. Um, I don't actually think she'd intended to kill herself because she purchased a return ticket from Victoria to Epsom, London Victoria to Epsom. She has state funeral, well, not state funeral, but she had a very high profile funeral in London and then another procession in Newcastle. 50,000 people attended that. Jockey who was involved, Herbert Jones, actually laid a wreath for Emmeline Pankhurst 15 years later, and also in memory of Emily Davison. He ended up sadly taking his own life in 1951, although there's nothing to say that was connected. He suffered concussion and a broken arm in the incident. Um, Many people see that as a turning point. Now, there's a few significant things that happened. In 1914, the government had an amnesty for all those who were imprisoned, and it formally ended the Cat and Mouse Act under the Asquith government, which involved the controversial use of force feeding suffragette prisoners. Um, they actually got something called the Holloway badge, which was, or the Holloway medallion, I believe, the Holloway brooch. It was basically a mark of those women who had been to Holloway prison and been through that. And in some cases, they'd been through it dozens of times, like the hardcore activists. About 1,000 women were imprisoned in the UK in this time, which has to be said was a very, very, very small fraction of the female population at the time. Um, it is important to remember that at the time, suffragettes were deeply unpopular. Um, and one thing I think is largely overlooked is that not all women's activists at the time were violent. They didn't all believe in that direct action tactic. Um, And it's very important to recognise that the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, which was led by Millicent Fawcett, took a very different approach from the Women's Social and Political Union, which was the suffragettes. So there is a differentiation between the suffragists and the suffragettes. A few years ago, when some London Overground stations were renamed, one of them was called the Suffragette Line. And Sadiq Khan found himself facing criticism because he dedicated it in front of the statue of Millicent Fawcett, even though she was explicitly against the direct action tactics. Now, this doesn't mean that she was any less passionate about getting women the vote. And by the way, just as a matter of record, I don't think anyone today would rationally argue that there wasn't a serious human rights campaign involved in that. Um, you know, the women who took real risks, they were doing it for the basic suffrage of women and human rights, and there were men who supported them as well. One good thing about the film actually is it does show some nuances. For example, when they bomb the home of a minister, the police detective who's sort of following them, played by Brendan Gleeson, says, the housekeeper had forgot her gloves. What she'd been 2 minutes late? What would that have done for your cause? There's absolutely no question that the suffragettes endangered life, not just their own, but innocent civilians. No question about it. Um, this was a radically different approach from the suffragists, who were peaceful and who distanced themselves from those tactics. Now, what I would contend is it's a misleading narrative to suggest that the violent direct action that peaked between 1912 and 1914 got women the vote. I accept that the Emily Davison incident was a turning point, but consider the fact that the People's Representation Act of 1918 was only partial suffrage. It wasn't until 1928 that women under the Baldwin government got full suffrage, that is, all women, not just women over the age of 31, as had been the case in the previous legislation. Um, this is very important because if you think about it, the peak of suffragette activity in 1913, full suffrage in 1928, that doesn't correlate. You would think if the peak of suffragette activity, if that action was going to lead to getting the vote, it would have happened much sooner. Would have the Emily Davis incident would have forced that to happen immediately, but it didn't. Now, of course, World War One had a major impact, and I would argue that the changing labour market brought about by World War One, also changing public attitudes, um, played a part in that. In fact, it's interesting that all the women's suffrage movements, like both sides, the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies and the Women's Social and Political Union, that is the Pankhurst side of things, put aside their activity during the war years. Ironically, Emmeline Pankhurst was very much behind the White Feather campaign, shamed young men for allegedly not being at the front, branding them as cards, even some who were on leave. Um, And, it doesn't need to be said that thousands of young men, many of them, in fact, were not fully enfranchised either. A 16-year-old killed at the Somme couldn't vote. So it's worth pointing that out. One good thing suffragette does is it does look at the fact that working class women didn't necessarily have the sort of luxury of pontificating in the way that Pankhurst did. I mean, she was distinctly upper middle class. Anyway, there's a lot to digest there. I think that a lot of people don't look into the deeper parts of history. And for over a century, there's been this narrative that the suffragettes got women the vote. And I just think there needs to be a lot more attention put on the suffragists, Millicent Fawcett and others. Yes, Millicent Fawcett has a statue, but the point is she explicitly distanced herself from those violent tactics. I'm going to go through some of the things that they've done. And it's worth noting that the suffragettes themselves called themselves terrorists. They described themselves that way. This wasn't just the press of the time. The suffragettes themselves called themselves terrorists. Now, if we define terrorism as using violent action to enact political change, then without question, the suffragette movement was terroristic in its nature. I'm going to read out just some of the things that happened in those years. Um, this is roughly in order, but bear with me. 1912, when that militant campaign really started in a big way, there had been an earlier incident with Sylvia Pankhurst in 1905. Actually, it was Christabel Pankhurst. Sylvia became a pacifist and she distanced herself from her mother and her sister. But in 1912, chemicals were put in letterboxes across London. 1913, a postman was burned at Lewisham Post Office in a letter bomb that is corrosive material that was on the letter. 1913, a third-class carriage consumed by fire at Waterloo on the Waterloo Kingston train, and it was just a miracle the passengers got out in time. 1913, three London postmen injured in letter bombs. 1913, nitroglycerine, a nitroglycerine bomb was put on the Piccadilly Circus tube station. Was ignited at the Piccadilly Circus tube station. Also that year, Sir Henry Curtis Bennett, um, there was a plot to assassinate him. He was a senior judge at the time. There was a bomb placed at the South East District Post Office. 200 workers were inside. Now, had that gone off, that would have been absolute carnage. It would have been a massacre. One of the first major incidents was in 1912 at the Theatre Royal in Dublin. Herbert Asquith was there and bombs were planted and a fire was set. There was no reports of injuries in that incident. Um, Other incidents, 1913, a bomb exploded next to the train line in Stockport and an explosion seriously injured the driver. A bomb was discovered at the Lyceum Theatre in Taunton in Devon, and there was an inscription reading "Judges Beware." At the Crown Court in Newcastle upon Tyne, a pipe bomb was discovered saying "Beware, run for your life." A school was burned in Sutton and Ashfield in Nottinghamshire, and also in 1913, several post office workers were burned in Nottingham by handling these letters. This was corrosive material, chemicals that were on them. In 1914, at the Kibble Palace Botanic Gardens in Glasgow, a watchman was almost killed by a bomb, which went off behind him as he discovered another bomb. Also, 1914, a guard was seriously injured by a letter bomb in Selwick in Lancashire on a train there. The very last militant activity is thought to be the 1st of August 1914 in Lisburn, when a bomb went outside Christchurch Cathedral. So we have a period there of about 2 years between 1912 and 1914. World War One, obviously, it ended. Um, it's not entirely clear, but it's thought at least four people, including two suffragettes themselves, um, were killed and at least 24 wounded. So there's absolutely no question that they risked lives, not just their own, but also innocent people, including women. Um, I wonder if how it would be perceived if 100 years from now the London bombers were inscribed in some sort of statue saying they were fighting for their cause. Now, obviously, I'm not saying it's the same thing. I'm not saying for a second pan-Islamism is the same as the fight for women's votes, but it was terrorism. It was absolutely terrorism. And it's easy to forget that they were deeply unpopular at the time. Most women didn't support them. I just think that when we look at history, we need to look at the nuances of it. Um, it's one of those things that just gets overlooked. It's like the transatlantic slave trade. The African complicity in that is overlooked. Was the campaign morally justified? Absolutely. Women's suffrage was a basic human right. Were the tactics justified? I'm not convinced because the peaceful methods of Millicent Fawcett, I would argue, ultimately did pay off. This idea that only the violent tactics works, think needs to be challenged. It's also worth noting that there was some public backlash against them, well, quite a lot, and at least in two incidents in Bristol and Doncaster, their own offices were attacked, so they got a bit of their own medicine in that sense. Um, Suffragette's a moving film. I recommend it. It does very much present that narrative that, oh well, the violent direct action tactics worked. They were necessary and they worked, so let's celebrate it. Historic reality isn't that simple. As the film itself acknowledges, it wasn't until 1928 that women got the full vote. I think the Emily Davison incident, she became a martyr, but I don't think she had intended to. And I think if she hadn't died, she would have just been locked up and she wouldn't have been celebrated. Um, but that did become a turning point, I guess, in the sense of public perception. So I suppose you could argue the militant approach worked in that sense. Um, Very briefly, when Just Stop Oil and Co. compare themselves to the suffragettes, I suppose what they have in common is both movements were deeply unpopular. Both movements used deeply unpopular direct action tactics, although the suffragettes were actually more violent. Although Just Stop Oil have infuriated the public and they have hurt people. Absolutely, they've hurt people. There was a woman who suffered a stroke because she was held up in a traffic jam that they caused. She couldn't get to the hospital on time. Anyway, I thought this would be worth looking at. I don't think anyone would reasonably argue that the women's suffrage movement was unjustified, but I just think we need to differentiate between the suffragists and the suffragettes. And I think it's about time suffragists got more attention. And I'm a little bit uneasy, frankly, when suffragettes are celebrated because it was terrorism. They were putting lives in danger with their tactics. So, feminists today might say it was necessary. Um, Millicent Fawcett wouldn't have seen it that way. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies didn't see it that way. They distanced themselves from those direct action tactics. And I think, I would argue Millicent Fawcett deserves just as much credit and attention as Emmeline Pankhurst, if not more. Yet she's not as famous a figure. Now, granted, the peaceful movement wouldn't get the same sort of drama in a film as the suffragette movement did. But there you have it. It's kind of crazy though that 100 years later, women are now in a situation where they're vilified for insisting that biology matters. So we've almost regressed when we think of the trans dogma that's going on these days. It's incredible. Um, so I wonder what the filmmakers of Suffragette would make of that. I don't know. Anyway, let me know your thoughts, but I think it's just an interesting look at history. Without question, the suffragettes used terrorist tactics. They themselves said that. They intended it. Um, should that be celebrated? I'm not so sure that it should, because it's very easy to judge society of the past and, to judge people for being angry with them. But what about the innocent postmen who were burned? Um, they also plotted bomb attacks on the homes of Lloyd George and Asquith and other ministers. So, they really did take it to extreme levels. Anyway, I'll wrap this up, but um, I think we need to be a bit more honest about that. People can argue that it was necessary, but let's just acknowledge what it was. They did put lives at risk. So the question becomes, okay, it's a just cause, but were those tactics justified? Some would say that the peaceful method had been used. I guess this argument would also apply to the ANC in South Africa and Mandela, where peaceful tactics hadn't worked, so they resorted to more violent tactics. Um, but in 1912, Millicent Fawcett and the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies didn't give up. They continued to campaign. They were just as passionate. They just did not believe in the violent approach. And I don't think that should be overlooked.